Welcome everyone to the Ontology Summit 2020. Today's May 27th, 2020, and I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, Professor Yolanda Gil of the University of Southern California, who is the director of the USC Center for Knowledge-Powered Interdisciplinary Data Science. And we'll be speaking on 7 ontologies for publishing the scientific record on the web. So I'm very excited and pleased to have her today. And go ahead, Yolanda.
Thank you very much. It's very exciting to see an ontology summit like this one. I was looking through the talks, and certainly a lot of topics that have to do with the development, the curation, the preservation, the dissemination, and the standardization of ontologies. I think those are all very important topics. So I want to thank you for having me, but also for organizing this summit. I wanted to talk about publishing scientific results and scientific products. I think in the last 20 years or so, it's become really clear to scientists that metadata is very important. And so there's a lot of data repositories, well curated, well described. They tend to focus on kind of the most upstream of the snow melting corners of a mountain in science, which is to do with the collection of data. So these repositories tend to focus on when data is collected at the instrument level, at the sensor level, at the lab level. And so they focus very much on describing that data, but everything else, the ocean of things that we do with science is not as well described, particularly computational results. And so when I read scientific papers, I'm trying to map all of these descriptions to ontologies that we've developed over time that we have found very useful to describe the scientific record. So I want to share with you kind of a compendium of all of these ontologies. They're published in separate places, but for me, this is a unifying theme in being able to publish the scientific record. So one thing that I like to start with is to realize that science has gone beyond the human individual scale. And so that was the case over the centuries, that it was an enterprise of a single person exchanging letters with others, but it was the enterprise of a single person and the view of a single person. Science has evolved little by little. So we see here Watson and Crick, and these are network diagram of authorship at the beginning of the 20th century, then moving on to the Human Genome Project and later on. And then what you see on the far right is the Atlas experiment. I think the paper had about 4,000 authors. And so I think that what you see is that the scientific enterprise becomes more and more complex as we face more modern or forward-looking questions. It doesn't mean that the other kind of science has not disappeared, but the amount of co-authors in papers continues to increase. And so we have to realize that the scientific enterprise is more complex than we realize. And so you'll hear a lot about how hard it is for scientists to keep up with the literature. What you don't hear so much about is that there's actually a lot of human limitations, cognitive limitations, limitations in the way that we do science. And I believe that they curb scientific progress. So I have some examples here. So humans are not necessarily systematic. And I use an example from a system that did text extraction of the fossil record from the literature and compared what this automated NLP system did, compared it with human manual extraction that was done over 20 years, called the Sepkoski Compendium. And the automated system was able to extract a lot more items of the fossil record from the same papers. Plus, it was able to extract records from papers that were in other languages, such as Chinese. And so you can give it more and more literature and it will scale up. The manual scale doesn't. But the main point is that it was not as systematic as we would like to believe that humans are. The second is that humans make a lot of errors. So I have an example here, is a classic example of work by two economists from Harvard. There was a student that could not reproduce the results, and after obtaining the data, realized that the analysis had some error in it. And so the results that had been published were still standing. They actually had a lot of influence in the global economy, but nevertheless, there was an error by prominent scholars. It's not unusual to see retractions of papers, even by Nobel Award winners. So I think human error is something that we have to be aware that we live with in the literature. Biases are also quite common. So there was actually a study where an AI system was generating hypotheses from observations in paleoclimate, and following a comprehensive route to all the hypotheses that were consistent with the data, and actually saw that the published literature had neglected to discuss some of the hypotheses. And when this was discussed with the authors, they basically said, well, I highlight the hypotheses that I prefer, or that I like better, or that are more consistent with my research, but it's not the case that all of the potential possible hypotheses are discussed. And so somehow there are some options that may be disappearing because they're not brought up in the literature. And then the reporting of the science is, I would say, poor. It's very challenging to reproduce scientific results. And we've done some work in this arena. But I would say that, for example, for bioinformatics papers, so it's about 3 months of a person's work just to dissect what an average paper has done. Much longer if it's a more comprehensive or more complex piece of work. So as humans, we have to realize that this business of writing papers, generating papers, reading papers, where we are the center of science and the scientific engine, is prone to all of these issues. And it certainly worries me that it is the case. So we've seen a lot of ontologies to describe data unambiguously. I think this is, as I mentioned earlier, extremely important work, not just for understanding and finding data, but also for integrating data together, that I think is a hallmark of science these days. There's also important work on publishing science products. So for example, in nanopublications, one can publish specific assertions or triples with their provenance. And for any scientific publication, there may be many of these nanopublications that need to be asserted in a structured way and published on the web. And then there's an entire project devoted to research objects, which means that you can describe anything to come out of computational research, from the workflows or the results to the slides or commentary that you do internal to the project. So trying to publish every item that comes out of research. What I want to do today is talk about different aspects of the scientific record where we have been developing ontologies and trying as much as possible to formalize and to make the scientific record publishable on the web. So I will kind of walk through this colorful picture and show you some well picked up examples of 7 ontologies that we find key to doing this work. So the first ontology was developed through crowdsourcing, where the crowd was scientists. And this is a standard that was the result of one single face-to-face meeting. This is quite remarkable, actually. And not virtual meetings either. So this was all done online. So in this case, the paleoclimate scientists drill cores on the ground. So you may be drilling in the ocean, or it can be an ice core, it can be sediment on a lake. And these cores tell you about past climates indirectly through what you're observing in them. So if you study ice cores, you pay a lot of attention to the size of the air bubbles. If you study marine cores, you pay attention to the coral remains that are in the core. So every sub-community and almost every scientist who collects these cores has their own idea about how to describe them. And they're all begging for standards. Every time that you see the hockey stick diagrams for climate, they are actually the result of several years of work by many trying to integrate all of these diverse kinds of data. So in trying to create this standard, what we did is develop a new approach that would help them crowdsource the characteristics of these cores. And so they would, as they're annotated their own core that they're working with at the moment, they would organically propose new metadata properties. So anyone could propose a new property. Then there would be a crowdsourcing effect in the sense that these properties that were available and proposed in the system would come back to scientists that actually wanted to uh, use similar terms, and so they could adopt them or not. Then there was some idea of votes on certain properties that seemed to not have agreement. And then finally, there was a control or an editorial oversight to make final decisions on the properties and kind of oversee the whole process. So this was very interesting because it did result in a new paleoclimate standard that's being adopted by journals, funding agencies, by the community. And to me, this is very significant because there is so much in science where you hear, we don't have a standard, we don't have a standard, we don't have a standard. And I think that what we've demonstrated here is that, despite the heterogeneity and despite the lack of desire of the researchers to actually participate in standardization processes, they were able to do this. One very important aspect of this, the success of this project, is to be able to use semantic web technologies and ontologies to enable them to interact with the way that they were describing specific cores, to be able to organize their properties, be aware that some of them were not officials, some others were official, and to be able to, vote with their feet, so to speak, in adopting properties and in steering the standard in their own way. And we put a lot of effort into creating credit and opportunities for the community to be involved. I think that there's many aspects that are socio-technical in this approach that are important. And perhaps aspects of the success of this is that we put a lot of effort into a core set of central concepts in these ontologies. These concepts came from the literature, and the scientists thought that they were perfectly well described and they were crystal clear to all of them. But of course, when you turn them into a logic where you're trying to take an extensional view on the concepts and sub-concept relationships, and to be able to really describe data in a way that is consistent across the different types of cores, what we noticed is that we had to help them differentiate real observations like measuring temperature with a thermometer versus proxy observations where you cannot measure the temperature from 1,000 years ago, but you have a proxy, maybe the remains of the coral or the size of the air bubble, to really see what that temperature was. So it's an indirect measurement, and how these things may be measured by instruments. Even the properties of that coral remain. You use microscopes, and there's instruments that you can attach your observations to. So we created this core set of concepts that really transformed and formalized their most basic terminology in these domains, unambiguously re-educated the community to adopt it, and then they would actually use this control crowdsourcing approach to extend the ontology. So I do believe that this could be something that can be adopted by other sciences. And in fact, we've had some conversations with the chemistry organization, I think it's called IVPAC, can't remember the exact name, to try to use this approach with for chemistry standardization. So that's about domain vocabularies. I want to talk about software because I think that this is a very neglected area, software and models. So we take a view that scientific software is just as important as data. I think it's kind of an aberration to have data repositories completely separate from software repositories. In my mind, these things could go together. I remember an astronomer telling me that the best description of my data is the software that I use to process it and to analyze it. And I think that's very true. And so what we did is look at software not just as an object that has code and you share in a code repository, but what's beyond the code and what are the properties of that software that would help a scientist understand what it does and compare different alternative software possibilities and so on. And so we developed an ontology that gets to the main things that scientists would worry about. So how to find the software, how to trust it, how to see who else uses it, how is it used, is it well debugged, according to others, related to their own domain knowledge, what kind of tasks does it do? And then there's a number of things to execute it, but not only that, but to be able to include it in their own experiments or run it with other software and so on. And so these are items that came from discussions with early career researchers that deal with software constantly and do care a lot about describing software properly. So this is an ontology that came out 5 years ago, and it describes not all software the scientists use, but the software that scientists produces and want other scientists to reuse. And so it's more domain-specific analytic software and software that you use to analyze scientific data, not so much software infrastructure that you would use for science. I hope that makes sense. So moving from software to, suppose that I've done an entire analysis and I have some results, can I describe the provenance of those results? And so we've also done work in this area actually with standards. So I think the community working on describing scientific products has been worrying about this topic for a while, and we had a set of provenance challenges that were instrumental to getting all of us to understand what needed to be described in different domains, in different contexts, in different functions. And so the open provenance model was an initial specification for provenance that was adopted in the sciences. And then I think most of people involved with open provenance model, we went to W3C and actually created a standard for provenance that is called PROV, that kind of took a broader view. We had, in fact, I was the chair of the incubator group that led to the standard, but we included people that worked in cybersecurity, people that worked in libraries and have been working with describing items and relating different versions of the same King Lear play from Shakespeare in different translations and so on, as well as people from the arts that worry about the provenance of objects. So we use it extensively to describe the provenance of scientific results. So the PROV standard describes, if you're not familiar with it, describes three major aspects. One is the agents, the organizations, or the people that are the engine of producing a new result. This is very important for accountability. The entities that are produced, not just the final result, but also intermediate entities. This is something that's rare to see in business process workflows and non-science processes. And then the third leg is the activity. So typically a computational method that is executed, but also a human going into a spreadsheet and re-ranking or filtering out certain things. So any kind of manual intervention or a visualization step is also included. So we published these provenance records for pretty complex computational experiments on the web. And we have a pretty large repository that we've had projects where we have mined this provenance to discover common patterns of use. So we have real neuroscience, neuroimaging processing workflows where we have found a lot of clusters of software that are used together. So you can see patterns that emerge from the methods that people prefer to do warping of the images to a standard reference brain, to other kinds of sequences of image processing tools that they're using. I think this is a very important direction to follow to standardize as much as possible science so that we can do more comparisons across separate publications and separate pieces of work. So moving from provenance to the actual workflows and processes, I want to talk about how we capture these processes. So a very important concept in our work is the separation between the process template, the process instance, and the process execution. And I know that NIST and in NIST circles, there's been a lot of work in this respect. And so I think, I remember, early 1990s, the process interchange format and other attempts to standardize processes. We focus very much on computational workflows. And so on the left is what we call a template. It talks about using a type of algorithm. In this case, you're kind of removing the morphological endings of the words with a stemmer and then sorting the results so you can count how many times the words appear in a document. In the middle is an instance of that. So it actually refers to a specific data set that you're analyzing. You mention a specific algorithm that you're using and so on. And then on the right is the actual execution where you can see what code was used, what software was used to run it, and the specific intermediate results that were obtained. So for us, representing these three things is important. The instance lets you reproduce, readapt the method very quickly to new data sets and new circumstances. And the template helps you reuse the method, but use maybe a different stemmer algorithm or a different sorting algorithm. And so that's a very important ingredient of the general method that was followed. So we have developed these ontologies building on PROV, and in OPM, because OPM, the Open Provenance Model, had more to say about these generic methods and the general rationale behind the provenance. And we've created a generic ontology for plans called P-Plan, and then OPMW that combines OPM and PROV to be able to describe these workflow templates. And so we've demonstrated these different ways to represent workflows and provenance in coordination through this ecosystem of workflow tools called WEST. This is quite old work by now, but we had 9 different workflow functionalities, from workflow mining to workflow editing to workflow execution to workflow composition. The tools came from 6 different research groups. The output of any given tool was consumed by 2 to 5 other tools, and the workflow representations allow different systems to consume different levels of detail about the workflow. So this was quite significant work. So just to show you the heterogeneity of the functionality and the tools that were used in that ecosystem. So these are the ontologies that I mentioned. All of our ontologies are published and they're in the slides, so you can find them. And we welcome comments and any thoughts for improving this work. But we use these and we publish workflows on the web every day that are publicly accessible. I wanted to also touch on hypotheses. This is a very important component in science, and we have a project called DISC on automating hypothesis-driven discoveries. We've done some work in cancer omics, and then more recently in neuroscience. Um, but the idea is that you have a hypothesis. In this case, there's a certain protein that's expressed in samples of a patient. That's your hypothesis. And we have knowledge in the system about when a scientist would face this hypothesis, how would they pursue it? So the first thing that they would do is to say, oh, anytime that I am, and then they'll mention a generic version of this hypothesis. Anytime that I'm trying to see if any protein is expressed in a sample, then I search for data for that sample, but it has to be sample data that, images from that patient doesn't help me because I'm trying to look for this protein. So I need to look for omics or, mass spec data, etc. So it will, we reflect it as a form of a query. And then we look for data from that patient of that type, of those characteristics expressed in the query, and then bring it back. And the line of inquiry tells us what workflows to use to analyze the data. So if there's data, we'll apply one workflow. If there's proteomics data, there's another workflow that may apply. And depending on how they were collected or their characteristics, there may be different workflows mentioned in the line of inquiry. And then there's finally a meta workflow that helps us combine the results and revise the hypothesis. So in this case, it's a mutation of the protein that was expressed in the patient. And we also will express the confidence values associated with that revised hypothesis. So our hypotheses are represented so that they capture not just the statement of the hypothesis, but also a qualifier that tells us what the confidence level was, what was the evidence that we amassed through the execution of these workflows. And then finally, we reflect the evolution. So if more data becomes available, then the confidence level in the hypothesis may change, or you may refine the hypotheses accordingly. So this is the DISC hypothesis ontology, and it's very narrow in scope in the sense that we've used it mostly for omics data and omics experiments, but there's a lot of work to be done to generalize hypothesis ontology so that we can express them properly. And there's a number of hypothesis ontologies, but I think that these four aspects that I mentioned are very unique to our work, because it's not just about stating the hypothesis, but about linking it with how they're analyzed and tested. And then the final thing that I want to touch on is causality and decision-making. I talked earlier about describing software and models, but I think, for a while now, I realized that models are often used to guide decisions, and unless you really understand the models and the assumptions that they make, your decisions will be may be misguided. And so in this era of the COVID-19 pandemic, I really see the need for a better understanding of the models, their assumptions, how they were built. How do we describe models to enable decision making? So that's the goal of a recent ongoing project called MINT. This is the kind of topic that I think about every day. MINT is really devoted to model integration, just to give us a sense for how different disciplines create models, what are their characteristics. So in our case, we're focused on food insecurity, water shortages, droughts, and also flooding that affect migration and food insecurity. We're very focused on sub-Saharan Africa. And so we look at all the kinds of models that one needs to use, and they're extremely diverse. So, for example, economic models may use agent-based approaches to look at groups of agents, while hydrology models are more driven by physics. Agriculture models use biological principles, and they have a lot of different crop variants and genomics information in them. So they're very, very diverse models, and really putting a picture together of what's happening in the region requires mapping together of these very diverse models. So it really forces us to have to describe these models properly. And you know, even if it's not for decision making, just for the science of integrating these models together, there's a lot of challenges. So we use AI techniques to integrate these models. And what I want to say is that, you know, we often think of models as an end on themselves. You create a model based on, you know, observations and data, based on physics principles, based on theories. You exercise the model in some way, and you know, you show that the model works or make some predictions. But we're looking at the larger context of the model. So you see here that, you know, even before you build a model, there's a lot of things and a lot of aspects that influence even the quality of the uncertainty in that model. So for a modeler to say, I don't have this type of data, therefore it's just not possible to build a model to the quality that I would like. So what can I do to find proxies for that data? And I think that you see a lot of that in the pandemic. So there's a lot of stages that have to do with gathering the data, scoping the problem, in our case, defining sub-regions for modeling, but really scoping the problem to a sub sub-regions that are homogeneous in some way, so that the model can be more accurate, calibrating the models. Then there's that blue region where we're developing the models, spending, as you know, 60 to 80% of the time preparing data. And then finally, there's a stage of preparing results and making results of modeling digestible to decision makers in a way where they can explore new scenarios and alternatives, and kind of try to really convey to stakeholders, not just decision makers, what the trade-offs are and how everybody can do better long-term in a sustainable way, or in the next season, etc., if everybody makes more data-guided decisions. So I tell you the story because it's in my mind a lot. How do we describe models? And we've been very focused on theory-based models from hydrology, from agriculture, not so much so far on empirical models coming from machine learning. But I think that this is our next revolution in ontologies, to really be able to describe models properly and characterize how they were created and the assumptions that they made, and in doing that also describe their shelf life. So if the data is from a certain period and we know that the observations are changing or the data is changing, then the model may have become obsolete. So we can detect that sort of property of the model. This has led also to a new version of our Ontosoft, our software description ontology, that connects better with all of the different aspects that we characterize in models. So now we care to think a lot about specific variables that the models take into account, and the values of parameters, etc., in a more formal way. So we go down to not just describe software as a package, but to describe how the software is invoked, and how it represents a specific style of model. So I gave you this overview of the 7 ontologies. I want to close with some thoughts about how to wrap it all together into the scientific papers and the publications. We have been doing for some years now an effort to describe scientific papers following templates or checklists, or ways to make sure that they describe all of these aspects that I've been talking about data, about workflows, about provenance, about hypotheses, etc. Scientists don't necessarily use ontologies to do that. We do, but I think in getting papers closer to be expressed in using these kinds of, at least the data models in general, is helpful. Uh, and so one of the most important things that we can do is use these kinds of ontologies to promote benchmarking and comparison. So I wanted to mention this paper that we had last year on the dream challenges, in particular from a proteomic challenge, where we use our representations to describe general methods, workflows, workflow instances, the data, and be able to generate solutions for this dream challenge that were the same as some of the entries in the challenge, where the entries were put together by the individual groups without having this rationale and this standard way to describe the steps and so on. And so I think it's very important to try to standardize the processes of science in as much as possible. I think that there's groups that do variants that are very interesting and unique, absolutely, for sure. But I think that a lot of science deserves this kind of comparison and being able to understand which of the 10 steps in a method in a paper actually mattered to get the better result, rather than, we use 10 steps and it's better. It doesn't mean that the other, the other 9 were just as important or crucial. So this is my thought these days. Will AI write the scientific papers of the future? Could AI systems crawl the web, gather knowledge about how science is done, be able to reason about it, mine the data on their own accord, and be able to write papers that maybe their writing is customized to different audiences? If you care more about the computational apparatus and the software, that's how the paper is written for you. If you care more about the general method, that's how the paper is written for you. But to really be able to have AI participate in science, and overall, whether AI or humans write papers that are more amenable to analysis. And this is the title of a recent talk that I gave, if you're interested. And I want to end with thanks to many people that have participated in this line of work, and take questions.
Thank you. That was really quite an inspiring talk. It very much takes me back to my early work in Ontologies, which was now 30 years ago, working with my student, Natasha Noy.
Yes.
We were developing an ontology for the materials and methods section of biology papers, because we found we actually studied this a little bit. When people in the biological sciences look for papers and then start to read them, first thing they look at after the abstract is materials and methods. So we wanted to basically formalize that and be able to search the literature and to reason about what was going on in materials and methods. So yeah, that was how I basically first got into this field.
Yes.
So really fun stuff.
Yes.
Now, we have a number of people who've asked questions on the chat. First one is Ravi. Give me a moment and I will unmute Ravi. Takes a second here. Go ahead, Ravi.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
I
Hi.
first want to congratulate you, Yolanda, for a wonderful series of ontology and ontology related standards and other discussion. Wonderful.
Thank you.
You were
Appreciate it.
very precise on time and you gave us a lot of time to ask questions. First of all, did you give us anything on collaborative aspects? It's one of the items on your slides, the general slide that repeats.
Yes,
You
you're
have a
very
collaborative.
observant. So This is something that
methods? Yeah.
this is something that I put in the slides because I think it's extremely important, but not an area where we have been able to create any kind of um, uh, you know common way to express collaboration. We did have a couple of projects on collaborative science, and collaboration in science has many meanings. You may collaborate in building a data repository, you may collaborate in creating a joint experiment in an accelerator, but what we meant is tasks where different subgroups of people work together to produce something that another subgroup of scientists will use, and so on and so forth. And we wanted to capture all these tasks and subtasks and the products from different groups, kind of more of a task-oriented collaboration. And you know, I've already had a couple of projects in this respect, and I find that it's very, very hard for scientists to think in these terms. So this is something that I don't feel like I understand well enough yet about how to capture. But certainly a lot of our workflows have this collaborative flavor. You can see a segment of the workflow, or a portion, a sub-workflow that has to do with epigenomics, and another sub-workflow that has to do with another, you know, proteomics analysis, and then all of this is put together overall. But you can see sub-communities or sub-areas where some subgroups of scientists have worked on. And so, but I think that this is an area that I feel we have much to do, and I leave it there. You know, I'm glad that you notice it, because I leave it there just to make room for it and bring up the
Good, good.
prominence
That
of
was
it.
good. Yes, related to it are the things that you described at the end, which were um, relating to modern publishing. If you open typical articles on topics of hot interest like COVID and other similar things that were happening a couple of years ago in genomes or genome related research tools, you see a lot of authors, and that implies they must have somehow collaborated. What kind of tools they use to reach a paper where there are 20 authors from different geographic locations and institutes. I give one example of, let's say, the COVID genome mapping, the gene mapping.
Yeah,
That must have,
yeah,
and plus the other research that's going on for testing and other things.
yeah.
But I'm now saying that there might be things like bioarchive or archive, ARXIV. These are kinds of modern publishing that I can think of, but can you go beyond that and lead us
Yes.
to something more futuristic?
Yes. So, you know, one thing that we've been doing, we collaborate with a project, a consortium called Enigma. It has 50 countries as members, and hundreds of organizations, universities, and hospitals. They work with neuroimaging and genomics data for neuroscience. And so the data is very diverse and the organizations are very diverse, but this is a consortium where they publish papers that have hundreds of authors, and I've been co-authoring some of them. And in fact, there's been two big papers, one about the um, cortical area very recently, that have even more authors. I think there's about 2,000 authors in those papers. So what we do is, if they do a specific study, so let's say, you know, depression on teenagers, to study a certain correlation between depression and other kinds of characteristics of the cohort. So if they do a study like that and there's 200 authors, the authors may come from different organizations that contribute data. They may contribute analysis that they do. So what we've done is try to automatically generate the list of authors based on their contributions. So we had a small workshop paper last year where we actually described, what the contribution of each author was, and then the consortium has certain rules or certain common practices that they follow, and to see how we could generate automatically the order of the authors and actually understand what each author contributed, so that we can write the little paragraph that you see in some papers at the end that says, this author contributed this or that or the other. So what we found is that for each of these, 200 author collaborations, the chairs or the organizers or the community comes up with a different approach to crediting and ordering the authors. But I think we're beginning to see that articulating what the authors are contributing is significant. And one thing that I will say is that for data sharing in science, it's extremely important to credit the contributors, and I think the contributors of data. And I think that's something that the Enigma collaboration does very well. They're not just crediting the people that do the analysis, but they're including all the way to the data collection efforts. And so that's kind of a little bit of how I would answer
very
that.
good.
Yes.
If you could share with us later somewhere a link to what Enigma does, that would be valuable.
Sure.
But the other question I had, and I will stop after that because Ken will stop me otherwise. So that is about models.
Uh-huh.
And the question is, how do you represent the models that you described, and especially the implied business process of reaching from models to decision support?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I didn't include a lot of slides about this, but I'll go here because one of the things that we do is that if you see in the blue, one of the things that we focus on is identifying objectives. So your model, the model that you choose and the way that you calibrate and prepare your model depends on what decision variables you have in your problem, what are the scenarios that you want to analyze, and what are the potential interventions that you want to make in that system. And so, our framework really worries about describing models in that light. So that's why we expose the variables that models consume and the variables that models generate. That's why we link parameters to potential interventions or decision points. So for example, in decision making, you may want to explore if fertilizer subsidies may change how the farmers will react. And so the fertilizer subsidies is an intervention that is linked to a parameter in the model that may be fertilizer price. So the subsidies are linked to the price. The price of the fertilizers is what's driving the model in actuality. So we link parameters to the interventions that they could represent. And so it's kind of a different way to consider models and to link them to the way that they're used. And I think models are often developed by scientists for scientists to do research. But when you're trying to connect them with decision making, there's always this gap. So we're very much interested in capturing that decision making context and motivation.
How do you depict the models? I mean, like, do you use a tool or relational model or physical model?
So through the ontology of models, right, you define model parameters, you link model parameters. One of the property of a model parameters is interventions. So we have a small interventions ontology that we've created. And so when a user is telling you, I'm interested in these variables and these interventions, we match that that description of their objectives that you see in the top of the blue area there, you match that description of the user objectives against your library of models. And so if they're interested in flooding,
I get
then,
it now. Thank you.
Yeah.
I get it from those two slides. I got it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for your questions.
Extremely good.
Thank you.
Many
Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. Now the next we have Todd. Todd, you've been patiently waiting.
Hello. Hello,
Hi, Todd.
Yolanda.
Hi.
Very interesting presentation. My
Thank
question
you.
for you has to do with any analysis techniques or paradigms you used in the development of these various vocabularies. I understand that there's, of course, lots of diversity in interpretations of even the same term, but what analysis techniques did you use? For instance, did you try aligning things with a foundational ontology? Did you apply ontoclean or whatever?
Yes. So um, our our common process is to start with the requirements and the questions for these ontologies. And so, so for example, for this one, we collected, if I remember right, more than 200 questions and requirements that we compiled just in the initial stages of development. And those come from the users, the modelers, the decision makers, etc. So that's a lot of different questions that you can ask of models. And then, at least for us, from our point of view, we're always using these ontologies for a purpose. And so as we try to use them within a system that's using the ontology for something, new requirements come about. So sometimes it is the way in which certain entities are presented to a user to interact with. Sometimes it has to do with additional ways to link things together in a way that conceptually makes more sense to a user, and so on. And so that also influences our thinking a lot. Then, of course, when we implement and populate the ontologies, we discover additional ways in which we could have done better. But for us, the measure of success is to have an implementation that actually satisfies their requirements. And we always have more than one domain or more than one way to populate these ontologies. So for example, here we've used it for hydrology models, for agriculture models, groundwater models, and we're starting to use it for the pandemic epidemiology models. And so it's the same ontology, and that gives us some assurance. For us, the most important piece is the publication of the ontology. And for that, we have developed some tools. Actually, Daniel Garijo, who's the first author in this ontology, won a Best Paper award for these tools to actually document the ontology. So if you go to any of these sites, they've actually been published following this very rigorous way to assign DOIs to each term, to include the definition of each term, and to have what you see in this window that shows all the classes. It highlights the classes, it gives you a visualization. There's a lot of steps that we follow to document the ontologies properly, and those turn out to be really crucial. So for us, the testing comes from the use of them and the satisfaction of requirements, more than using tools that will check classes and subclasses and the properties and so on.
Well, so what you described were a lot of good engineering techniques, especially when it comes to the provision for natural language definitions associated with each of the elements. But I didn't hear you mention any particular ontological analysis techniques in that list of engineering processes.
We do not use
Okay.
any ontological analysis tools. The only tools that we use are in
No, not tools. Not tools. I'm not worried about tools, but just the process of analyzing a term. Whether you can, at this point, I don't believe, and Kenneth can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe there are any tools that you can use for the general ontological analysis that I have in mind, i.e., whether it's aligned with a foundational ontology, whether you've identified identity criteria if you need them, or any unity properties and relations, and so on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So we don't use any tools for that. The only tools that we use are for ontology publication. And at the moment, I can't remember the name of the tool that we use to publish the ontologies, but it is fundamental to helping. Sometimes we have 20 people using the ontology from different perspectives, from modelers
Right.
to users to developers to project managers, and so it's very useful to have these. And I'll find out the name and the paper and send it along.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm done, Kenneth.
Thanks. Next person is Leah. Just a moment. Leah,
Hello. Yeah, this is Leah. Hello, Dr. Gil. Thank you for a great presentation today. I just wanted to ask you, for full disclosure, I am a librarian. My background is mostly in doing research, but I've delved more recently into the world of taxonomy and ontology. My question is about bibliometrics, and I was wondering what interaction you've had with that community at all. I see a lot of your work about ontologies having particular interests, especially when you're talking about methodologies and making sure you're parsing out all the different types of inclusion and research work. And I was just wondering how that idea of, attributing work and attributing weight to a particular person can be varied or be problematic if you're weighing, their data analysis contribution versus their data collection contribution versus a librarian maybe contributing to a literature search or a lab technician contributing to, oversight of an experiment. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
So I think I mentioned these Enigma projects that have hundreds of authors and how we're trying to understand the contributions that lead to including someone as an author. I think that those are very, very, in my observation, very domain specific and also very group specific. And I see it in my own work that almost for every paper we have different criteria for inclusion or not. It's kind of like, there's general criteria for grading exams and homework, but then every person does it in their own way, and for every exam is done in a different way. So I'll say that, but I will say that for libraries, if I may change the topic, if there's any other librarians in the audience, we've done a project very recently, which is to turn digital library collections into data science resources. And so at USC, we have in our digital libraries videos of dances that are special collections that have been donated to the library. So imagine using dance videos to articulate different styles of body movement, or to be able to automatically detect or cluster types of dances together to help dance scholars detect new types of dances in the same way that AI has helped astronomers detect new types of clusters of celestial objects. So collections that have videos, collections of photographs that show you the same corner in the street over years, but no one has noticed among the thousands of photographs in possibly dozens or hundreds of collections that is the same corner, and you can see how it evolved over time. Graffiti in the street, there's collections that have thousands of photographs about graffiti. Can we train systems to recognize the handwriting or the styles, or detect trends in graffiti artists? So there's just such a treasure trove in digital libraries of challenges for data science and interesting things to do with data analysis that I hope that you all will consider. If you're more connected with ontologies and metadata, we'll be putting out a paper soon on how to describe digital collections with metadata that allows scientists and researchers to access those collections for analysis and science. So.
Thank you. One quick follow-up question. I was just thinking about when you're talking about ORCID IDs and researcher IDs and how those figure into all of this. I'm not sure if you've done any work or consideration on how those work into your work.
Yes, so we don't use them directly, although of course when we publish, we use them as well. I think they're very, very important. Just not something that I include here. I think that there's a lot of these ontologies for science and standards that just kind of take some time to percolate into the culture, but they're not as related to the kind of research that we do on the ontology side of the scientific process. So so I support, encourage, and use them myself. It's just not an area where we find some good research topics that fit our skills.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Janet had a question. Janet, are you?
Yeah. Oh, did you unmute me? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yes, this is wonderful. And we had a speaker early on who said that that he thought that the best ontology work could be from the library science perspective. And I think this really reflects that fact, that you're addressing real needs of people working with data, very high quality level, and you're doing very high quality work. So this is wonderful to see these different ontologies addressing different aspects, and they're heterogeneous, which is interesting for some of the debates that we have a lot about. Is there a common upper ontology that could span all of these in some meaningful way? Question I put in the chat was that for your AI, it would seem that it would need to, you would need to have that. You would need to have an upper ontology that would span all of these rich, heterogeneous ontologies that you currently have. So any aspect of that you want to address?
Yeah, so I think it is difficult for me to express or to measure how general these ontologies are. So for example, if you were to take this one that we have in the slide, the ontology for models, and try to apply to material science models, for example, I don't know how well it would map. I suspect the basic principles of using software to analyze data would apply, but what I find is that each domain is sufficiently different to bring up some new twist or some new requirement. Think that, for example, in our case, we're using these models to support decision making, and so we already have these extra requirements or these extra aspects that would not come up in a purely scientific research kind of description of the models. So, the development of these, high level and general ontologies, I think there's much to be done there, particularly for science. But I will say that whenever we start any ontology, we always look for ontologies that exist, that have been developed, that we can reuse. And so we've been working with ontologies to describe cohorts in clinical trials. And so, of course, we look for the disease ontology because those, diseases are used to describe inclusion or exclusion criteria. We look for ontologies that exist that we can use as starting points. And I mentioned earlier that for the linked Earth work that we did on the paleoclimate standards, that this controlled crowdsourcing process was successful, but a big measure of that success was that we made a huge effort to reuse standards for core concepts. So we went to the semantic sensor ontology and ontologies like SensorML to look for general principles of, I'm very fond of SensorML, for example, because it is very rich in terms of describing instruments, the processes that take place in instruments to take the measurements, et cetera, et cetera. And so by walking this community through those general, very, very general, high level core ontologies was extremely helpful to set them in the right foot to then extend things with more domain specific aspects. So I wish there were more generic and high-level ontologies for science, and more standards that were applicable across sciences. You know, we try our best to reuse them, and hopefully some of the ontologies that we're developing can also help do that. We're collaborating with a group that is looking at how software is described in GitHub, in Dataverse, in Zenodo, in many different sources in DataSite, to be able to create a very general ontology of software. And so I think, you know, wherever that ends up, we will map to that ontology. So I think they're very important, and we use them as much as possible and try to contribute as much as possible.
Great. Actually, we're running a little over. Yolanda, could you take one or two more
That's
questions?
all right. Sure, sure.
So we have Gary. Gary.
Yes, can you hear me, Yolanda?
Yes, go ahead. Hi,
Hello.
Gary.
Hi. I have a sort of a question from one of your last slides on the open question about will AI write the scientific papers of the future. I noticed that of course you have an ontology dealing with hypotheses. I'm wondering about some directions you might take. For example, if you're writing a scientific article, you would get into some speech acts, performative verbs like request or asserting, stating, questioning, refuting, things of that nature, to the additional relationships that you might have currently in your hypothesis ontology. Any thoughts along that line of how you might expand some of your models to have a AI actually be able to write a paper in the future?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. And I think the way that we're considering the statements of hypotheses are, you know, at the moment, simple association, right? So a protein is associated with this type of cancer, or we'll say, you know, a certain feature like age is correlated with, you know, hippocampus size or things like that. So we have extremely simple hypotheses. In reality, in science, the experiments have much more sophisticated hypotheses. So I think there's a very rich connection between, you know, having, for example, biological pathways or entire models of some discipline, and using them to tease out a hypothesis and understand how that hypothesis fits with the model. Because ultimately, you are right that you get a confidence in a new hypothesis, and if you're very confident, it becomes part of the theory eventually. So you need to understand how to phrase that hypothesis in a way that connects and extends an existing theory. And these are areas that I know Tim Clark over at Harvard has been thinking very deeply about, also in the area of neuroscience. But I think we have much to learn from this. And you know, since I've worked quite a bit with hydrology and agricultural modeling, it's not so much driven by hypotheses, it's more driven by questions about a system. So you ask, you know, will there be potential flooding in July? That's not a hypothesis that, you know, it's not a hypothesis that there will be flooding. It's a question about whether or not there will be, and a question about the extent of the flooding. And so I think there's much, much, much to do in this area. And it's, I think it's a very important component of reporting papers. So I often see, you know, report your data, report your software. You know, we advocate that you report your provenance and your workflow as well. But just as important is the hypotheses and how they connect to existing theories, and how they connect to all this evidence that you're amassing through the analysis. So, but that's a very good question, and I agree. I agree, it's very important.
I would just add that in complex situations like climate change and the current viral situation, there is sort of things that don't prove a hypothesis, support a hypothesis. You have competing hypotheses, and that's very important.
Yeah, I think sometimes rather than hypotheses, I would say there's questions, right? Like how fast will this spread, or rather than a hypothesis statement. Yeah, that's very true. Thank you, Gary.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. What I'd like to do is announce that next week we're going to have a panel discussion about standards for knowledge graphs. We expect to have Michael Gruninger, as well as Barry Smith. We possibly might get Ramanathan Guha and Lisa Carnahan. So I definitely invite everyone to come next week. We hope you can all participate in that. And I think actually there was one more question. Patrick, are you still here?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, so basically, this is basically a great talk, and I love how for every ontology you have a directory standard documenting that. That's actually very good. I like that. And my last year in grad school, or my entire grad school, was about using ontology for cybersecurity and cloud computing. So one of the main challenges I always run into was after I do this cool model using protege or manual vocabulary design, I had to implement them into a back end. So I found some commercial triple stores, but when I'm transitioning to make open source on GitHub, I cannot say you have to buy this license. Finding an open source that is good enough to maintain the large million triple I have generated has been a challenge. And I assume with your many ontology have designed, you may face similar challenges. How do you overcome that, or how do you go about saying, we have this standard, but for development, you can then think on how to use a standard graph database or convert it to a SQL-like database? That's kind of my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a whole another talk. But I will say that at ISI, at my institute, we have a very strong group that has been using knowledge graphs and semantic technologies for a long time. We have tried just about any triple store you can imagine. We do a lot of work with Wikidata and Wikibase, always pushing the boundaries of those. We've used Semantic Media Wiki as an organization platform, so we run across issues of scale continuously. I'm not prepared to tell you what is the triple store that we use at the moment, but I can tell you that we're constantly assessing, evaluating, and benchmarking the triple stores. But our knowledge bases are quite large. We do run replicas of Wikidata even, we do quite a bit of reasoning with them. So if you're interested, maybe that's something that next year we can come and report to the group and tell you what we've learned from those experiences.
Wow, that's great. Okay, with that, I think we will adjourn, and hopefully we can have you come again next year, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. I'd love
Great.
to.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the questions very much.
Okay, and everyone, please come next week for this panel discussion, which is going to be the last regular session of the summit this year.